the happiest guy on earth one day. We were just getting in the car to drive to Florida for our winter vacation, and he said, I'm gonna publish your book. And I'm like, oh my God, we need to turn around and go back. Wasn't gonna happen that day, so the process is I had this big manuscript. It was 400 some pages, and we have an editor we work with, John Torin, and he said, we're gonna cut about 65 pages out of this book. And this story was one of them, and I'm like, you can't take this story out. This is one of the first stories I wrote for this whole thing, and we're not taking this out, so we fought. We actually came to physical confrontation, and I won, and it's still in. And he didn't think it fit the, he thought I was getting off on a tangent here, but he finally came around. John's a really good guy. We've become really good friends, but boy, I fought for this. Anyways, this chapter 30 is called Lost and Found. But something that happens at Sears Lounge, right down on Lake Street here. Here we go. Back in the 60s, my father loved nothing more on a Friday night than to walk the aisles of the giant Sears store on Lake Street, just to look at things. The building was enormous, a towering Art Deco skyscraper that served as the company's regional mail order headquarters, but at the same time offered 2 floors of retail space. On this particular Friday night, he had brought along Jimmy and me, the 2 of us no more than 5 or 6 at the time. We had come, of course, in Mom's old Plymouth, which Dad parked a half a block away on Elliott Avenue, before taking our hands and crossing busy Lake Street to the store. Once inside, it was no less majestic than the Grand Bazaar of old Constantinople. The aisles crammed with shoppers, the counter folks busy pushing their merchandise, the air filled with the intoxicating smells of caramel corn, roasted peanuts, and popcorn. Our first stop was always the candy counter, where Dad purchased 2 boxes of buttered popcorn, one for himself and one for Jimmy and me to share. We stayed close behind as he led us through the maze of sensual delights, the sparkling glass cases of the jewelry department, the hushed silkiness of women's fashions, the smell of new leather and shoes, the whir of domestic machinery and home appliances. Beneath the escalators of the 2nd floor, the exhaust tube of a noisy Hoover vacuum cleaner spun a giant beach ball in an invisible column of air, a sight that never failed to mesmerize me. One time when I was there with my mom, I tried walking up the down escalator to get a closer look at the suspended beach ball. The agent who sold life insurance in the Allstate kiosk below spotted me and shouted, "Hey kid, get off there!" That was actually a friend of mine's dad, I found out years later.
Yeah.
That was Mike
Mary Kay,
Sicard's
yeah, Mary
Yeah.
Kay Sicard, George Sicard. Yep. I thought of that when I heard it.
You did, great. On this particular night, Dad must have had something specific in mind, a new tool for his workshop perhaps, or even a gift for Mark's or Betsy's June birthday, something he didn't want Jimmy or me to see. Whatever the reason, he decided to ditch us. Well, not ditch us exactly, but leave us to our own resources for a few minutes, while he went off to conduct his business. He led us to the rear of the store, where we climbed 2 steps to the raised mezzanine of the toy department. Here, the endless aisles overflowed with more than enough treasure to occupy the imaginations of 2 small boys for as long as he needed, or so he thought. He parked us in front of the Tonka toy display and issued a stern order. "You boys wait here, I'll be right back." Jimmy seemed only too content to finger the bright finishes of the toy trucks and tractors, testing the movable doors, cranking the tiny steering wheels. But as I stared down the aisle of toys and watched my father descend the 2 steps back into the main part of the store, his familiar head slowly melting into the mass of humanity, I began to panic. Why is he abandoning us? I grabbed my brother's arm. "Come on," I said, "we need to find Dad." I gotta put my glasses on. There we go. Without a word of protest, I was his big brother after all. Jimmy fell in behind me and as I began my search pattern. We passed all the lone landmarks from our earlier route in, but the once familiar counters now seemed foreign in this sea of strangers. The spinning beach ball was my lone beacon of hope, and I paused before it, thinking that surely Dad must be here somewhere. But he wasn't. And after a while we moved on, searching down one aisle and up another. When I felt like we had searched the entire store, I did what any other 6-year-old would do in the same situation. I stood with my brother's hand in mine, and I looked bewildered. Within moments, a matronly woman bent to console us, her brow raised in concern. "Are you 2 boys lost?" I nodded in the affirmative, my chin too quivery to speak. To my relief, she took my hand and pulled the 2 of us in the direction of the main door, where a Minneapolis cop stood talking to an agitated customer. We waited. The woman looked down at me and smiled. He'll know what to do, she said. When we continued waiting, while the conversation between the cop and the customer only seemed to intensify. I pulled on the woman's arm. I know where our car is, I informed her. She raised an eyebrow. You do? Yes, I replied, and I motioned toward the door. It's not very far. She led us out onto Lake Street and went down the sidewalk toward the intersection with Elliott Avenue. As we waited for the light to turn, the sun was just then disappearing at the far end of Lake Street, dipping into the distant waters of Lake Calhoun. We crossed the street and walked a half block south down Elliott until I saw Mom's lime green Plymouth slouched at the curb. The doors were unlocked, as most doors were in those days, and the woman ushered us into the back seat. Now you boys stay right here until your daddy shows up, she said. I'm sure he'll be along any minute. And then she turned and headed back into the store. Jimmy and I sat in the rear seat of the car eating what was left of the popcorn, staring at the faces of other shoppers as they streamed past, the evening light growing dimmer and dimmer. It was nearly dark by the time I spotted Dad coming along the sidewalk, his silhouette crouched low as he approached the car, his eyes frantically searching the shadows of the back seat. Suddenly the door flew open and his strained face was inches from mine, his voice breaking with emotion. God damn it, here you are, he shouted. I couldn't tell if he was laughing or crying, so peculiar did his voice seem to me. Then I realized that he was upset, and it frightened me that he was so upset, and I began to understand that I had done something terribly, terribly wrong. We should have stayed in the toy department as he'd ordered. Now totally ashamed, I began to cry, but quietly so he wouldn't hear me. I didn't want to make him any more upset than he already was. Jimmy, meanwhile, picked through the last few kernels in the popcorn box, his own innocence assured. Dad finally slammed the door shut and stomped around to the front, cursing a blue streak as he climbed in behind the wheel. He started the car and drove recklessly down the side streets, muttering to himself, his eyes focused on me in the rearview mirror, and I knew I was in big trouble. But by the time we made it over to Blaisdell, the one-way heading south, his driving had become more focused, and I could tell he'd calmed down a bit. He'd even turned on the radio, tuning into the Twins game on CCO. Halsey Hall's familiar gravelly voice filled the car with a needed degree of comfort. When a Ham's beer commercial came on and Dad began humming along, "From the land of sky blue waters," I could tell he'd calmed down even more, and I began to wonder that maybe my punishment might not be so bad. At 38th Street, where he should have continued south, he turned right instead, passing Incarnation Church on our left, and then on to Grant Avenue, where suddenly things seemed to get a lot better. Across the intersection glowed the welcoming lights of the Dairy Queen, and I sat a little higher in the rear seat. He pulled the car up to the curb and got out. I watched as he approached the takeout window, the moths and mosquitoes flitting around his head beneath the yellow lights. He bent and gave his order through the screen, and a few moments later he returned to the car with a couple of nickel cones, each of them dipped in hot chocolate. He leaned in through the window of the back seat. "Here," he said, his voice now much more conciliatory, and he reached across me to offer the first cone to Jimmy. Jimmy took it without comment, but smiled at this unexpected treat. Dad paused before offering the second cone to me, his face inches from mine. "We won't tell Ma about any of this, will we?" he said. His words more in order than a request. I nodded silently in the affirmative. "Good," he said. Then he handed me my prize and walked around to the front to get in. Jimmy bit into the chocolate crust of his cone, and a string of ice milk ran down his chin. Dad passed a handful of napkins over the rear seat. Then he started the car, and we continued on our way home. When he started singing the Ham's beer song again, I knew for certain that everything was going to be just fine. I bit into my cone, the chocolate still warm and melting on my tongue. This had turned out even better than I could have imagined. So, this is called the Q&A. If you have any questions.
How did you remember all of those facts? You know, we were there too, but I can't remember like at Sears and this one here. The ball, you know, I mean, we all saw that at Sears.
You remember all these things?
Of course I do.
Remember what it was like going in there on a Friday night or anything? So it's just like, my God, it was...
I worked at the Dairy Queen, for heaven's sakes.
Exactly.
I probably served your dad.
You could have been there that night.
I could have been, yeah. They were nickel cones back there, 5, 10, and 15.
Well, if you've read this book, you'll know
I
that
did.
in the initial chapters, there's a story about him. My father loved to tell stories, and he I always thought this was his therapy, you know, there was no such thing as PTSD. He needed to talk about what happened to him during the war. He saw some really incredible action. So he would gather us all in Kathy and Betsy's bedroom and lay across these bricks, and he would sit in there, open a window and smoke cigarettes all night and tell these stories. And, you know, when you get used to that as a kid, and you remember this stuff, and you know, there was always a question in my mind, well, what if he had died, you know? So anything he told me was just something that always stuck in my head. And anything he did after that, he was a great big physical guy, you know, he was as big as I am now. He was an imposing character in our lives. You couldn't help but listen to him and remember the things that he told us. And a lot of these were great stories that he would tell us about growing up on the farm, and I tried to capture some of this in the book, you know, that and in all honesty, I think my siblings were kind of afraid of him, and we had that traumatic scene at breakfast one morning where he told me to go wash my face. I looked like a Philadelphia whore, and I thought, I've had enough of this. We're gonna start battling right now. That's what our life became. It was just this give and take. So I remember a lot of the things he told me, just about everything. And then later on in life, I kept a journal. I still keep a journal. I've kept it for over 40 years. And as I was writing this book, as I say in the book, I talked to my dad every Sunday night on the phone. Either he would call me or I'd call him. And Monday morning, I'd write down our conversations. And when I was writing this book, I just had to go back to all these Monday mornings and write down some of the conversations we had. A lot of them were never very pleasant. We just argued about everything. Which, I don't know, maybe it kept his blood pumping. I know it kept mine pumping. And it's kind of funny because in talking to people about, as I was writing this book, I'd interview people, ask them about their dads especially, but their mothers too. And you know, my experiences weren't very odd from anybody else's that had a father of the greatest generation. They weren't necessarily predisposed to say things like "I love you" or it's just the way they were. And I don't feel like he was cruel in this way. He was just like every other dad of that generation. And then digging even further, I found out that this was just amazing. People had never told me this. A lot of fathers were severe alcoholics, and in some cases, yes. And in some cases, I attended a little incarnation gathering one night a few years ago, and 3 people said, "Well, my dad went out for the proverbial pack of cigarettes and never came home. They deserted their families, and they grew up with that." It's like, so I think I was pretty lucky to have a dad that would tell us the stories, and only call me a Philadelphia whore once in a while.
So I remember your dad quite well.
I'm sure you
And he took me to that wrestling chapter was great, because he took Jim and I to the wrestling matches one time. And you did that so well, the Great Dane, how he chopped him in the chest and he spit on your dad. And I remember being there, they'd like hit you, and these guys would just spit everywhere. It was great. It's like, oh, I remember that. Yeah.
You know, it's odd though, I tried to find a picture of the Great Dane when I was writing this. It's like he didn't exist.
I looked it up. I looked it up too afterwards.
Did you find
I remember the name. I couldn't find him either.
I remember this guy vividly.
I remember the name.
He had that hair all combed back.
Yes.
He got hit, it was like a curtain hanging in the road. Then he get hit.
Yeah.
He was just saving this. He just, I think he chugged about a half a bottle. This is when he came up.
Yeah. Oh, I think they all did that, because he said it right away. Remember, Jim and I peeked around the curtain. You know, they'd come down behind the curtain. We peeked in there before, and Larry Henning was in there.
Yep.
And he looked at us and he goes, "Why aren't you two out stealing hubcaps?" But you know, I never knew your dad to smoke, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I remember Mark, your brother Mark. He turned 18 or 21 or something, and your dad gave him like $500 because he hadn't smoked. Is that?
That was my mom that.
Oh, your mom did that.
was
Okay,
her.
okay.
I never got it. I was the one kid that didn't do it.
Okay. Because I remember. So that was your mom's.
Yep.
Okay.
That was her.
I remember Mark sitting in his bed, you know, the bunk bed.
Yep.
Sitting in his bed, the other one, and had taken this money out of his duffel bag, all these $1 bills, and he hadn't smoked. So
Oh my God! Wish he was here right now.
yeah.
Yeah, that was a big deal. That was a lot of money in those days.
Yes,
$500
yeah.
bucks. I was like, wow. And it worked, I mean,
Yeah,
I was incorrigible. De La Salle. Could've gone to Benel, could've gone, been right next to the
Could've
Benel,
walked,
but no, I'm
could've walked.
smarter than these guys, I'm gonna go down.
Could've been with this guy here. And then I didn't realize what a prankster he was, and then something came back to me. I was on the balcony, you know, overlooking the backyard one time. I was over there pretty young. And all of a sudden, he came out, picked me up, and Mark was down in the backyard. He goes, "Mark, catch, we got another one here." Like he's gonna throw me over. I was like, I'm petrified.
Well, here's another story that John Torrance took out, which I was a little upset by, but you'll appreciate this. My mother was correct, we had 70 kids on our block. I mean, but that was pretty common in that neighborhood.
Yes, oh yes, yeah.
So we'd have these touch football games out in the street. We'd have substitutions sitting on the curb ready to go in. So Betsy was out there, she's probably 13 years old, and all the Murphy boys and McDevitt boys, they were out there. There was this whole, you know, teenage running thing going on. All of a sudden the window bangs open on our second story, and my dad's hanging out the window with Betsy's training bra. And he's going,
Oh,
"Hey Betsy, you forgot something."
oh, no.
And she just turns beet red, and she goes running in the house crying, and I remember looking at my dad and going, "What?"
You.
I wanted to go up there and just punch him. I was so angry. It's like, how could you do that to your own daughter? And I mean, he had a twisted sense of humor, and I try to sympathize with him in this book, saying that he grew up on this farm where it was just all the entertainment you could make on your own. You know, you just had to find. And it was always making fun of each other. That's the way he was with his brothers his whole life. They just tormented each other.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. He was a product of his upbringing, and I guess I was mine.
Great
You
book.
get down to it. Yeah. Maureen remembered that. That was something she brought up when I was reading. She said, "I remember when your dad did that. Betsy was so mortified by that." Then, of course, they'd bring a boyfriend home. Good God. He'd make up names for him. It was always about some physical deformity they had.
Oh, no.
And I'd sit and watch this thing, God. And I've been accused of doing the same thing with my own kids, I guess, but, you know, if it's in your gene, I guess you can't get away from it. But I don't know. I try to be a little more.
So John, speaking of making your own fun, my wife Kathy used to stop the minivan with the kids at the side of the road when they went by a farm south of town, and everybody would roll down the windows and moo at the
Yep.
cows that were standing out there in the field. But I've never met anybody else in this world who did that until now. But we read it in the book.
Well, I got a guy up in Canada right now who read the book and said, "But you come up here this summer, we're gonna have a contest." I'm sure I'm better than you are.
Tell me a story about he said he stopped and they were in Australia.
Yeah, he was doing it down in Australia. What did he say? Talking about.
They didn't respond.
They didn't understand.
The language. Yeah.
Little
Translate.
Canadian, yeah.
Canadian
Canadian
accent.
accent. I said, "Did you go moo, eh?"
May I ask how your siblings and your children responded to the book? I just figured everybody had secrets growing up, and we didn't talk about our family secrets.
Well, the big in this book is my brother Jim, and Jim had mental issues. He
I
still
know
does.
that.
He's still alive,
I know.
and you know that was something else that the editor said maybe we should back off on this, and I said, well, this was one of the main things between my dad and I at the end of his life, is that he wouldn't address this. We would. This was one of the things we had our biggest issues about was Jim's welfare. You know, what was going to happen to him after my dad died? And so I was reluctant. I wanted this in the book, but to what degree? Because John took a lot of that story out of this too. Some things that I had to get off my chest about my brother, because I wanted to kill him one day. I was so angry at him about something he did when our mother was dying. And this was a whole chapter in this book, and he said, "We're going to take this out because this is just you venting your anger about your brother." Because it's really frustrating, you know, if somebody has
It's a real travesty, really.
It is, and the fact that, well, you know, Jay here, he was one of my brother's best friends, and you could tell you what it was all like when Jim started going into his decline. It's just frustrating. And the fact that my dad, as I explained in the book, he wasn't intellectually or emotionally built to deal with this. He was just a simple farm kid who just thought Jim was lazy and,
Oh.
yeah, it was just, I don't know. Anyways, so yeah, there was some issues here that, you know, I actually expected Jim to be here tonight with an automatic rifle.
He surprises you. He does. I know Kathy said he came to her condo in St. Paul. Was it when Bessie died?
That's exactly as I wrote about it in the book. You know, when I came home on leaving the service once, he and Betsy were walking around talking in Vulcan. And this is all they talked in. Were you part of this?
I remember that.
And I'm like, what world is this I've descended into here? So they were very close. So when Betsy was dying, nobody had heard from him in 10 years. And he had a P.O. box over here, and I sent him this message. If you ever want to see Betsy while she's still alive, you need to come see her. Give her a Vulcan mind meld. Maybe that's what she needs right now. And he showed up. He just showed up at hospice one day. It's like, wow, that's pretty amazing. He came to her funeral. This is another weird story. And he was dressed to the nines. He had this beautiful suit on. He had the matching handkerchief and tie and brand new wingtips on. And when he was leaving, I walked him out to his. I said, I'll give you a ride home wherever you're going. He said, no, I'll ride my bike. He was riding his bike. He took off on this bike down this alley, you know, dressed up in this suit with wingtips on. I thought, this is really strange. He got about halfway up, all of a sudden he stops, he turns, he comes back. I'm still standing there. And he said, I forgot something. And there was a couple of garages there behind the funeral home. He walked down between these garages, and there was these 2 5-gallon buckets. And he came out and hung on his handlebars, and I looked. These were these sweaty, dirty clothes that he'd probably worn that morning, stopped at Kohl's, bought this suit to go to his sister's funeral, and then headed back to wherever he was going with these clothes back on, I assume. That's the last time I ever saw him, 8 years ago. Yeah. Anyways. Cheer up.
Yeah.
It sounds
And-
like you have a lot more to say. Would you write another book? And if so, would it be along the lines of a memoir, just more stories? Or do you have a novel in there somewhere?
I actually had a signed contract with the Minnesota Historical Society back in 2012. A book I had written about working on the river with this curmudgeonly guy named Captain Bill Bowl, Jonathan Paddlefer. He used to have the TV commercials. We go, come aboard! And it was all this. I like to say he was the first Donald Trump that
Oh.
first graduate of the Donald Trump School of Personality. He was a character. He was a character. He was a strange character. And I was writing this before about I was going to the U studying English, and I took a summer job on the Jonathan Paddlefer. I'd operated boats in the Coast Guard, so I got my license really quickly and went up to the pilot house, and I thought, well, this isn't a bad job. I could do this for the rest of my life. Anyways, I was writing these little columns for this little West Side newspaper, little vignettes about working on the river, and this editor came down and said, you need to write us a book about this. So I did. And it was all set to be published. They shot the cover. They had a bunch of speaking tours like this lined up, and then some lawyer said, we better get this Captain Bull character to sign off on this, a release. And so he had sold the company by then, and I had to go give it to him. He lived right over here on 36 and River Lake, Calhoun, but he loved it. He said, this is a goddamn masterpiece.
Yeah.
And then his daughter came up from Florida. She was around in those years. We were writing about something that happened in the late 70s. She'd worked there then, and she had a pretty bad drug and alcohol problem. She'd gone to Florida, started a new life, and she came up and she wanted to read this book, so she did, and she just said, he's just poisoning your whole life. He's got some axe he wants to grind against you, and I'm like, he's telling me this over the phone, and he's just screaming at me about it, trying to destroy his reputation. I'm like, you just told me yesterday you love this book. What happened? Oh, Beth read it. And anyways, so they said, we can't publish this book, he's gonna sue us if we ever publish this book, so. Anyways, that's sitting in a drawer at home.
Is he still alive?
No, he died about, I don't know, 10 years ago. I went to his funeral. And the rest of his kids were very apologetic about this. They knew what this was all about. But she came up. She didn't say, hi, how are you? She said, just because he's dead, if you ever try to publish that book, I'm gonna sue you. I said, well, it's nice to see you too. Anyways.
But you're working on something. Or was that a secret?
No. I used to enter these short story competitions through the Loch McKnight, you know about these. And every year I'd never win them, but I have like 20 short stories that I'm rewriting right now. Norton doesn't publish fiction, but he's gonna make an exception for me. I'm just kidding.
So are you and Kathy the only two that write?
No, Mark down in La Crosse,
That's two.
he's got a different genre altogether. He writes these little vignettes about people that live in the driftless area down there. They're really interesting. But it's like,
What a
boy,
family.
boy. And Jim's actually a good writer. In writing this book, I went through all these little letters that he had sent me when I was in the service. And, did he ever write you a letter?
No,
Did you ever write him?
no, I know he was a good artist, he was a good artist.
No, that I didn't know.
Yeah,
Good artist.
yeah.
Huh.
He could draw. I remember we did a project on the Aztec Indians. We take the bus down to the library downtown, we're in like third or fourth or fifth grade, whatever. And he made this poster, and he had these Aztec Indians that, on this huge poster, he did all the work, we got made, I didn't do anything. And he drew these Aztec Indians that looked really good, yeah, he was a good artist.
I didn't even know.
Yeah.
Wow. I've learned something here today.
Well, he was very talented, and he was one of the most popular kids, and he ran for president of student council. I was his campaign manager. He lost to Mike Keene, who now is the assistant district attorney for the state of New York. So, he had some tough competition.
That chapter I just read segues into this one, and it starts out, Jim might have been the brightest of us, certainly brighter than me. Yeah, he was in the National Honor Society and the
Yes.
Key Club, and
Yeah.
he went through University of Minnesota Aeronautical Engineering School, which is a 5-year program he went through in 4 years.
Yeah. Amazing, yeah.
And that scene where I described, where I went up, I was going to the U there when I got out of the service, and I went up to get him, and he was sitting there in his underwear. He'd been there
Yeah.
for at least 16 hours, working on one problem, he said, some physics problem. Had no track of the time.
Wow.
And I'm like, boy, boy.
Yeah.
So put some pants on, let's go down to Stub and Herb's. I'm like, well, that's a great idea. Yeah, one of the things my dad, and I used to tell my dad things I probably shouldn't have told him, but Jim came to spend time with me that one winter when he was on vacation, and he'd never smoked marijuana, which I thought was really odd. So
Yeah.
I offered him, and he did it. And this was during that first Gulf War. No, what the hell was it? It must have been like 1980 something. But he wanted to sit. Oh, it was the Iran hostage deal, and he wanted to sit and watch it because he had a vested interest in this. And he thought some of his products with nuclear warheads might be deployed in this. And I thought, boy, you're in a whole different world than I am.
Yeah.
And he was speaking Russian. He took Russian in college, and he could speak Russian fluently. Anyways, my dad, I told him about that. I said, boy, Jim, why are you smoking marijuana? Just like, well, he never had. I just thought he might like to try it. Well, that's his problem. That's his problem. You got him addicted to heroin and drugs. Anyways. Yeah. Well. Yes.
Do you remember, I have a vivid memory, even though I was like out of the loop, so to speak, that you guys scared the hell out of me, because I had to hear about it when you did the Night of the Living Dead
Yes.
and all the zombies, and because there was all these extra things of liver that, because it had to be realistic. And
It was. We made a movie in Kathy was very creative, and they were visiting she and her husband Randy one summer, and they had just gone to see the movie The Night of the Living Dead. And this Randy, he was a character, he said, we should make a movie like this. He had a friend who had a butcher shop, and he had all these intestines. So we made a movie comparable. It was called Zombie Bloody Zombie. And oh my God, we can see it on YouTube.
Can you on his one?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. It's been digitalized. Yeah. Yeah, so Jim's in that.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to look that up.
Zombie, bloody zombie.
Zombie Bloody Zombie. There was a movie back then called Sunday Bloody Sunday. But,
Yeah, you're right.
yeah, exactly.
And that was right behind Vanilla, wasn't it?
We filmed a climactic scene where, yeah, the zombies are chasing these two scientists that are trying to kill them. Betsy was one of them. She falls. The zombies devour her right on the 30-yard line. The effects, it got an Oscar nomination, special effect.
What'd you use for blood?
We had real blood. Like I said, my brother-in-law knew a guy who worked it was Bredeson's Market, remember that?
Right, yeah.
And he came home with big bags full of blood and guts and bones.
Oh my.
There's a scene where I'm sitting there reading the paper, the headlines are zombies attack Minneapolis. And there's an open window behind me and two zombies drag me out through the window, and the next second, all these bones are coming up. And they're like eating me raw, they're chewing on my leg bones and arm bones.
Oh my gosh.
It's fantastic.
Oh my God.
Zombie bloody
I
zombie.
got to hear about that before I went to bed.
I'll bet you did.
Yes.
Yeah, that was like 1971. That was only 53 years ago. You just turned 60, so you were like 7 years old. Unbelievable. Where did those 53 years go?
But I remember the stuff now that I read the book.
I was telling my daughter about your book and that I was coming here tonight, Allie,
Mm-hmm.
and she took a little trip down memory lane of you telling stories of
Up at Warpo's cabin.
Warpo's cabin, scaring the hell out of all the kids.
Well, you know, the apple doesn't fall far from the
Oh, she was speaking fondly of it though.
But now I have these, yep, I'm gonna have a 5th granddaughter here next month, and this is heaven on earth for me. Get these little girls around a campfire someplace, tell them the same stories. I remember, I wrote them all down. Yeah. Anyways.
Don't show them that movie though, 'cause
No, not to
Oh,
yeah,
that's-
yeah. Remember those stories, isn't it?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
they were little, and so little then.
I have pictures of them all sitting around with John's in the armchair and all the kids are all around him on the floor, like 25 kids or
I
however
think
many
Gina
there was.
Sakars is in there too. She always wanted to join my kids.
Was Gina?
Warpo's sister. Yeah.
Oh, that's right,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, Rachel, what should we do now? Unless anybody has any more questions.
I do.
I'll stand up here and talk all night.
I was wondering how Jim handled your dad once you left.
Well, this is interesting because there was just the two of them home there for a while. And I witnessed some very traumatic things between them. My dad didn't understand Jim. And Jim, he probably felt worse about my dad than I did. So he had some pretty bad encounters. We had a the summer my mother was dying, we were all up at this lake home they had up in Alexandria. And Jim was, he was in his decline, he was living in his car, and he had gone up there to basically park in my dad's driveway until my mom died. It was really getting on my dad's nerves. And it all just came to a crescendo one day on the driveway there. We had brought our little baby up to, see my mother, and oh my God, they got in this screaming match in the driveway, and it was the stupidest thing. My brother's car he couldn't get it started. Dad wanted to leave. He's like, get the hell out of here. And the car wouldn't start. And then my dad's anger was just reaching the boiling point. He said, why have you come to this point in your life? And my brother, he grabs his wallet, and he's like, because I have no money. And he's like, look, I have no money. I mean, he'd been this nuclear scientist out in California, but he'd lost everything. He started a forest fire out there. coincidental thing, but, it was a big, all these fire departments got involved, and they were garnishing his wages. He basically, she was just living on pittance. And that was part of his decline, was the fact that he had lost all of his self-esteem. They took all of his money, so. They had this really screaming match in the driveway. He had no money, and what was he supposed to do? And I couldn't stay in this driveway for as long as he wanted. My dad, his wife was dying. It was just a very traumatic scene, and not a very happy time in anyone's life.
So, how about Mark? Did Mark have a good relationship with your dad? Unlike yours?
Completely different than mine,
Okay.
yeah. He was-
So did your dad listen to Mark when it was time to go into the facility?
Well, he didn't wanna listen to anybody. He knew what was gonna happen. Kathy had been out there, I'm sure she's told you this about the
Yes.
squalor she found there, and she was working with this social worker.
But I mean, when you dropped him off at the farm, now.
Oh, well, yeah, he realized later that that's where he needed to be. It finally
Okay.
dawned on him, but, initially it wasn't so good. Here's a guy who was 96 years old who lived on his, independently his whole life. And suddenly it's like, you need to be locked up here for the rest of your life. You're a hazard to yourself. He knew that. He knew where he was going, and he didn't wanna go. He tried to jump out of that car in Albuquerque, New Mexico that morning.
Once he was at the farm and you could see the animals and you had the dogs out, that's kind of how it ends there. So
Well, it
I
actually,
knew what was happening next.
it was good the first 6 months he was there. Then he really started to decline.
Okay.
And, he didn't know where he was. I'd go down there and visit him, and he'd be asleep for a whole hour. I'd be there, he'd never wake up. It was, I mean, he was 98 and a half years old at the time. So he lived a long life. And all of his brothers and sisters all lived well into their 90s at home. They all died in chronological order. It's just amazing. All well up into their 90s. 9 kids. Yeah.
It's a great book,
Oh,
a lot of memories.
couldn't put it down.
Teddy, I remember Teddy, the dog.
You remember Teddy?
Oh yeah, I tell Peggy, because, we still live in my mom's, I bought the house from my mom. We walk around the neighborhood all the time. Teddy would chase cars and just,
Teddy's owner came to the first book signing I had. He
Dave
said,
Lasoda?
yeah, he goes, you mentioned my dog,
Yeah,
but you don't
he-
mention me.
his wife is related to Peggy. His wife and Peggy are like second cousins, so,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's a small world.
Yes, yeah. I remember that little terrier chasing those cars
He
with
get
barking
kicked by
away.
a motorcycle about once a week.
Wow.
Yeah, and chase rocks. I mean, nobody kept their dogs on leashes.
No, oh no.
Dogs were just free to roam the neighborhood.
Right, yes, yeah.
There'd be packs of them sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, you know who they belong to. They just,
Yeah.
well, that's the Weston's dog, and that's the,
Yeah.
whatever. Didn't make any difference. It took a village back then.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Rachel, what do you think?
Should we sign some books?
I'll sign some books.
Sure.
If you sell some, I'll sign them.
Great, thank you.
I'll sign those too.
Here.
Absolutely, it all counts. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you.
Best video.